Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of my anthurium care 2-part mini series. So part 1, which I'll link in the description, was a lot more formal, a lot more structured, and I honestly bit off a little bit more than I could chew because in that video I had fully planned on doing a Q&A based on all the questions and suggestions of topics that you guys submitted on Instagram, because there was a lot. So I decided to break it off into the second video, which is going to be way more casual than that video. So it's going to basically be like a repot Q&A. I have a bunch of anthuriums I need to repot for various reasons, and I have a list of them here. I wrote down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And this is my opportunity to kind of check on them and see if this is now the right time to repot them. So if I look the same as I did my last video, my allocation video, it's because I literally just filmed that video and I still have battery and I still have energy. So I thought I'd do the intro to this video. I'm not sure if I'm going to film the repot today. Honestly, haven't decided yet. But yeah, that's why I look the same. So this is my opportunity to look at the plants and see, like, is it the right time to repot them? Do I need to wait? Are they putting out new leaves? Etc, etc, and that list might change. So the first one on the list, this is definitely getting repot, I think. This is my tofu getii. This is a hybrid I did with Jing. So the mom is tofu. I'm just gonna insert B-roll of tofu here. It's a no ID from Indonesia. I think it was bought as like Ace of Spades or something like that. But it's distinct enough that we just gave it the name tofu, so we each know what we're talking about when we're talking about that particular plant. And the pollen parent was my dark form for getii. This one is the most robust seedling I have grown in the seeds that I was given. It's a lot of leaves, and the lower down leaves are yellowing. There's 2 leaves yellowing, maybe a third. They're kind of looking a little bit sad. This substrate's looking a little bit dry, but mainly it's just at that point of like roots filling out the pot that I'm ready to get it up into a bigger pot. It did put out a leaf. For some reason, it ripped itself right here. Looks like a little fenestration. I honestly kind of feel like maybe it just got a little bit dry while I was expanding, because this certainly feels quite dry, and it's like enough roots in this pot that it's drying out that pot pretty quickly. So I'm not too fussed about whether this leaf fully expands or not, because sometimes if you repot it, it can kind of not kill a new leaf, but make it kind of seize up a little bit and not expand to its full potential. Who's next? Oh yes, this one is a definite repot. This one I showed in that last, or the first part of the anthurium care video. This is my magnificum crossed with Conaya lens. And I talked about in that video how the new leaf like never fully expanded. This is as far as it's really going. And I'm pretty sure the roots are all rotten. And I think it was because I let it get too dry and then I drenched it, dry rot. It's probably gonna stay in the same pot, but I'm just going to like get all the rot off, kind of sanitize it with hydrogen peroxide and get it back into the same mix. And I think it will bounce back just fine. But that's SOS repot. Oh, this one. This one actually expanded so much more since I filmed that video. So I did show this plant in that video. This is Ace of Spades crossed with Luxuriance. And this leaf is looking so good. I am so proud of this leaf. Like, it's perfect. It's perfect. This is Charmaine's plant. She gave it to me because she was having trouble with it doing this kind of thing. All the leaves are doing this. So I feel like rehabbed it at this point. It's in straight tree fern, but it's probably amended with some pon and perlite, and then there's leca at the bottom. I feel like this is too dense of a mix for Charmaine. I think I need to make it chunkier to give it back to her. I'm gonna get it back into drainage, but right now it's in no drainage. I'm not even too worried about whether this expands any further than this. I feel like it has some ways to go, but I'm not really worried about that because it looks great. It looks great just the way it is. So yeah, that's just gonna get moved into a chunkier soil tree fern mix with maybe more chunk in it in drainage. And then we're gonna say goodbye to this baby. Okay, so this one I didn't realize had pushed a leaf. So this one's I'm not sure about. I haven't decided. But this one is also Ace of Spades crossed with Luxuriance, but this one is mine and it's from Woohoo Tropicals. This one was like honestly a little bit of a finicky one for me when I first got it. You can't see this now, but when I first got it, this like where the brown crispy stuff is, it was just like kind of yellowy and looked kind of almost fungal, but I don't know. I don't really know what it was. And then it grew one leaf and it was like stunted and didn't form properly. And then I didn't really change anything. It was potted in the same thing the whole time. Then it pushed this out and it's perfect. It's beautiful. And then I'm like, okay, so the roots look pretty full in here. It's ready for like a proper pot setup, kind of like this kind of situation. And then it just pushed out a leaf. I honestly feel like it could be fine so long as I don't fuss with the roots too much. And I just kind of pull this out and leave it as intact as I can and just like transfer it to the next one. And I honestly, I'm going to just cut these leaves off at that point. We'll just be left with like this one for sure. Maybe this one since it's not yellowing, and the new leaf. Actually, you know what? No, I'm gonna leave it on. I'm gonna leave it on the plant until this leaf grows, and then I'm gonna cut it off. By that point, these leaves might be like well on their way out anyways. Another Lux hybrid I have to do, and this is a definite one. It actually has reached caterpillar stage, but this one is red crystallinum crossed with luxurians from Woohoo Tropicals. This leaf, okay, so in that care video, I was talking about how it's time to repot your plants when the new leaves are not sizing up anymore, or if they're sizing down. And it might also be in conjunction with like dropping or shedding lower down leaves at like a pretty rapid pace, like a bunch at a time, despite the roots looking good. So this is well overdue for a repot. It's really full in here. And this leaf is not an upsize from this one. This one was a big jump from the one before it, which would have been this one. This is a very satisfying upsize, and like the color on this when it was emerging, it was so pretty. It was like purpley reddy, and it had a very holographic look to it, very oil slicky. It's such a pretty one. So I was like slightly underwhelmed by the size up on this. And it also is looking a little bit chlorotic. Amanda pointed this out to me the other day when I was like showing the emergent leaf. I was mainly showing it because of how blistery and like pustulely this leaf was. And she was like, it's looking kind of like when she burned her anthuriums using silica. So she was like, be careful about the silica maybe. And I have never given this silica. So I was like, it's not the silica. And I thought it looked worse on camera than it did in person. But as it's hardening off, I can see that it's getting a little bit chlorotic. I feel like just upsizing the pot will do the trick. And the next leaf will be a nice jump up in size. My only concern is, will I still have room for it in here if I get into a much bigger pot? In my first part of the video, I said I was going to skip the next size up pot for this, which would be this size. So like this. I said I was gonna skip it, but honestly, I might actually just go back on my word and get it into this next size up, purely because I cannot fit the even bigger pot in my tent. I don't have any space on my outside shelves for this plant, so I think we're gonna sacrifice the humongous jump up in size and get it into this pot. This is not being repot, by the way, but look how beautiful this is. This is Carla Blackie crossed with, no, sorry, that's wrong. This is Magnificum crossed with crystallinum crossed with Carla Blackie. And I just put out a new leaf. I'm so excited for this one to grow out because this leaf, oh, it's so nice. Look how dark it is. Honestly, Amanda's Mag Chris is the mother or parent to such beautiful crosses. Like, it's got such nice reds and purples. It's such a good specimen. If you ever have a chance to get our Mag Chris hybrid from Amanda, I really recommend them because they're really nice and they're not really like hyped. When you have something like red crystallinum, which is still like the same parents, like a mixture of Magnificum and crystallinum bred over generations and generations, but the genetics are the same. So sometimes when you have like a really nice Mag Chris, Crystal Mag hybrid, it can present very much the same. So whenever she breeds this plant, it means good things for the babies. So if you ever had that chance, I would really recommend getting one. I don't think she's done this hybrid again, but if you're watching Amanda, you really should do this hybrid again. This one is also from Woohoo Tropicals. This is a Wenlingeri, and it is ready for a proper pot. This was started off in a no drainage setup in a plastic cup, but I think it's ready and it's so cute. I'm so happy to have this Wenlingeri because it is like a thinner leaf kind that's more dimply than my Wenlingeri. And it's been growing pretty steadily. I damaged this leaf tip. I was trying to take a picture of it when it was like just poking out. And I just slightly damaged the tip, and now as it's expanding, it's magnifying the damage. And then this one, I'm not sure of. So this one is also from Amanda, but it has a leaf that is expanding. This is what she gave to us as Magnificum, and that's what it was sold to her as. But it's definitely not a pure Magnificum because the petiole is not a perfect square, but it is very squared. It has angles to it, but it's not a perfect winged square like Magnificum. Okay, let me take this packet off so you can see the leaf. I love this plant. It is so pretty. It reminds me so much of Carla Blackier. It's just so dark, such pretty venation. The new leaves look like this. Look at the neon veins. It's so pretty. So I had to chop the last leaf because it got so badly damaged by spider mites, and I was just trying to treat it. I was like, I'm not playing around with this plant, so I just chopped that leaf off. It has rooted quite well in this pot, and the roots are kind of coming out the bottom. Actually, it tried to come out the bottom and then it dried out. So I want to get this into a bigger pot. I'm just, right now, as of today, I've decided now I'm not going to film the repot till tomorrow. I am not sure if I want to repot this yet. Just because I've been waiting for this leaf for so long, and right now, it doesn't look like there's spider mites on it. That looks like a predatory mite because it's so big and juicy and fat. And you can also see how many mites are on this leaf. This is like, I think, yeah, the little speckly guys, the ones that are just the size of dust, are the feeder mites, I think. And then the fat round ones, I think, are the predatory mites. So this was on my list of plants I needed to repot, but I actually think I might wait for this leaf to harden off. And this plant is also now in caterpillar. You can see kind of in the petiolar sheath here, there's a little Toblerone right there. And it almost looks like it's trying to push something out of this petiole, which it can't be a flower yet. It's too young. I might repot it, I might not. I will decide for sure tomorrow. One plant I wanted to repot was my Ace of Spades, which I showed in the first part of the anthurium care, part 1. But it just started to poke out this leaf. I did say I wanted to repot it once this was hardened, and I ran out of time. I wasn't expecting it to put out a leaf this soon, but it's pushing out a leaf. So I think I'm gonna have to wait because I don't want to sacrifice the leaf size on this one. I really wanted to get it to mature. I think I mean, it's in caterpillar now, and it's like possible it'll flower. But my idea was to get it into a taller, larger pot so that I could sit it right on the shelf, because right now it's elevated by the deli cup and it's a little too close to the light, and it's getting a little bit bleached and leaves are starting to turn away from the light. So I will repot it, maybe just not today, not until this leaf hardens off. And I'm really happy that this leaf is coming out here because it's gonna come out this way right in between these two leaves, which means I can get rid of these leaves. I can finally chop these two off and I'll have a leaf right here to balance it out, because before I was kind of hesitating on it just because if I got rid of these two leaves, it would look so silly, just empty space and two leaves just going off in different directions. So I'm actually very excited to see this leaf coming out right in the perfect direction. So as of right now, I have 6 definites. I will take a quick look tomorrow before I start the repot to find any other ones. But basically, I have a lot of questions I answered in part 1, but there's like some like ones that are just maybe too specific to answer in like a general care guide video type thing. So I'm going to answer those. Maybe there isn't actually as many as I thought there would be, because there was hundreds to begin with, but I think I've answered a lot of them in that first video. So I might tomorrow just kind of go through my tent again, go through my exos and make sure there aren't any other ones that need repotting. And then we'll just be repotting in the kitchen and just answer some of your anthurium questions. So I see you guys tomorrow. I had some time to reevaluate my life choices from yesterday, and I've decided against repotting a couple of things. So I'm not going to repot that Magnificum hybrid from Amanda, but instead, this plant that I always forget about is my Veitchii. This is the narrow form. So I have this potted in like tree fern, amended tree fern, but it always dries out and I always forget about it, and it starts to drop lower leaves for that reason. So what I'm gonna do is I wanna plant this up into tree fern soil. And I feel like that's the only one that I added in, but I cut out that magnificum. And everything today is gonna go into tree fern soil. I'm going to assess Charmaine's plant, the Ace Lux, while I have it out just to see if I want to make it chunkier. But other than that, everything else is plants I'm keeping, so it's pretty much all going into drainage, tree fern soil, probably leca layer at the bottom. And I'm gonna have your questions out on my phone while I'm repotting, but I haven't really sorted them through. I'm just going to like scroll through and pick questions that are ones I didn't answer in that video. And a lot of these questions are a little bit more like, please diagnose this problem kind of thing. So yeah, it's not going to be as organized, as curated. I'm just going to like pick questions that pop out as I go. I think I'm going to start with the Macuna, the Magcuna, because that one I think is going to have to soak a little bit in hydrogen peroxide since it is like root rotty. Yeah, so it's this plant here. So I kind of touched on this in the first video, but one question was, what does it mean when an emergent leaf looks perfect but hardens off really small, smaller than previous leaves but without any visible damage or pests? So I kind of showed an example of this in that first video with my Vag Lux. That one had a new leaf that hardened off smaller than the previous leaf, and I chalked that up to me not sizing up the pot soon enough, and it was like really root bound in a small little coffee cup. But that can also happen if you let that plant dry out while it was expanding that leaf, and it just kind of like prematurely ends the expansion of that leaf. But I'm pretty sure that wasn't the case for that plant, because while it was pushing out that leaf, I don't think I let it dry out. I think it was really just like being too root bound, and it just pushed out a leaf that wasn't an upsize anymore. These roots are so rotty. Look at all these stringy roots, or like the inside core of the root. I don't even know where those roots went. They're probably all blended into the soil now. I guess the good thing about it is that I can get it back into the same pot, or like the same size pot, without sizing it up because I don't have a lot of space in the tent. This seems okay. The stem does not seem rotty. I actually want to just rinse this off because I can't see what I'm doing, and I almost feel like I want to chop the original chunk off, this one, because I have a good amount of stem that I've grown. So we might do that after the hydrogen peroxide soak, of course. Look at everything is rotten except for maybe this. One thing, it wasn't a part of the questions, but I've seen people ask this on Facebook, is like, can you just cut a healthy root? Not a healthy root. If like the whole root is not rotten, it's only rotten on part of it, can you just cut to the healthy tissue and it'd be fine and we'll continue rooting from there? And the answer is yes. So long as where you cut it, you see like all healthy tissue inside. That looks really rotty. Okay, it's all rinsed off. Pretty much everything is rotten. There's probably like 20% left that's not rotten. See, this one is rotted up to here. It's white and pinky up here, and then it's brown down here. So let me see. Okay, I've cut it like this. It's right here. Well, there's dirt on it now, but it's all white tissue there. I don't know if it's going to be like very helpful because it's just a short little root nubbin, but like if you have a long root and you just cut off the rotten tip, it should be able to root healthily from there. Advice for keeping emergent leaves from tearing. I don't know if like I really have this down. Like I assume they mean on emergent leaves grown in high humidity, because when that happens, the only really like great way to prevent that from happening is keeping your anthuriums in high humidity so that they can expand with enough moisture and juice in the air, because like when something's dry, it's a little bit more brittle. So if you have high humidity, I'm talking like probably 70–80% plus, then that becomes really easy. But if you're growing in dry conditions, I would say like maybe 40% and down, that's something that just happens for a while until your anthurium is strong enough with a good enough root system to make sure that it's like pulling up all the water it needs to expand a leaf nicely. But it still happens no matter how healthy the root system, no matter how good of a grower you are. I have friends who grow a lot of beautiful large anthuriums in room conditions, and that's like in the northern hemisphere. That is non-tropical conditions, and they're able to do it, but like they always have little tiny tears in the leaf, and that's completely normal. So I think the only way to like completely prevent that from happening is use of greenhouses and high humidity enclosures. But of course you should make sure that while it's pushing a leaf that you never ever let that dry out. You could also make sure that you're on top of like keeping CalMag and your nutrient rotation so that the plant has a lot of strength in the cells to be able to expand without ripping. Okay, so this is about 50-50. Where's my chunk? 50-50 hydrogen peroxide and water. Just gonna let that sizzle in there and probably pot this up at the very end. We'll come back to that. I think, okay, I'm gonna reuse this leca, obviously. I have this little strainer that I've been collecting leca for when I have the energy to actually sanitize them. One question was, would love to know if you've seen better growth in soil / tree fern mix than pon. Yes, I will say that is true, but I can't really definitively say like soil is better than pon for me, because when I was growing primarily in pon, and I'm just talking about anthuriums, I wasn't really keeping on top of watering very well. I was like a very bad underwater. And I think for now, I want to say in the last 6 months, I've been quite on top of it because I am working from home for the most part. So I'm so much better at watering now than I was like a year ago even. So I would say that's probably like a big part of it, and one really big reason why I have been enjoying soil so much. Not just because like I really like soil, like like I just like to play with dirt, but it also is way more water retentive than my I'm keeping this, by the way, I'm going to sanitize it. It is way more water retentive than pon, even if I'm using no drainage. I experienced stunted growth just due to not staying on top of the watering very well. So yeah, like I think tree fern soil is like my main substrate now. Okay, next one, I want to do Charmaine's Acelex because I'm really antsy to get it into a nice little pot. Okay, how to know when to water. This is like a really interesting one, and I've been like thinking about this a lot because of my friend Jose. And I mentioned a few times that he grows in pure lechuza pon the majority of his plants, and he treats pon like soil. So he would have pon in like a pot like this, and he wouldn't keep a reservoir in it. So he just water it through and it would drain out, and whatever that pon soaked up is what the plant gets, which terrifies me, honestly, but it works for him. And the only reason why a lot of his plants started declining is because he went away to Australia, and he was saying that he has to water every few days. But his plants in general are a lot drier than, let's say, like Lauren's plants at the shop. These roots look great. I am not even going to, I'll just loosen it slightly and then mix some tree fern soil through. But I'm not gonna take too much of it off. Anyways, Jose's plants have just kind of adapted to holding on to water for longer, I guess, and those roots aren't as sensitive to dry as some people's plants that might be really on top of the watering, and the plants are used to having moisture all the time and like quite a bit of it at that. And it also depends on like what your watering style is. So like I personally like to give all my plants like a good drink every time. I don't know, my mind wants to give it a good amount of water. So obviously the amendments in the substrate are really important to make sure that it's harder to drench and get really muddy in the substrate. I ended up taking off so much substrate. I'm just gonna reuse this leca. So like for when to water for me would be like a lot longer than when to water for Jose. But for me, I usually look at the color of the substrate. So if we're talking about soil, this is not a direct comparison, but I have tree fern soil here, and then the wet tree fern that just came from that pot. So this is like, oh my gosh, it really needs water, and this means like there's moisture in the substrate. I really like just going by visuals when you have so many plants to be taken care of all the time. I can't like pick every single plant up, and obviously clear pots really help with that. So provided the pot is not super algae ridden and you can't even see through, because like look at this. This is my veitchii. It has a lot of algae on it. So oftentimes this will look like moisture and I would just like not water the plant when it actually was super dry. So this is why it got underwater so many times, because I would look at the pot and be like, oh yeah, there's moisture in it. Under this light, this algae is very obvious, but under when like more shaded conditions, like maybe if I shade it with a leaf, it looks more like moisture than dry. I have more or less of a routine with my plant room plants because I'm like in there every day and I'm checking them religiously. I've never been so on top of checking my plants until now because I'm so like fixated on getting those plants to flower, and I'm just like waiting for flowers to emerge. I'm like checking on the stages of the inflow. So I guess to sum up, start at the very least by making sure that that substrate never fully runs out. So it's kind of safer to let it run out like 80% and there's still like 20% moisture in there, and then go in with like a nice water. But over time, I would say there is a training that your plants kind of go under, that they get used to whatever you give them to a certain extent. Also, I've decided not to amend my tree fern soil any further for this plant because I'm feeling it right now and it's really like fibery and fluffy. So we're just gonna keep it as is because it's been working for me, so there's no reason why it shouldn't work for her. One question, and I can't answer this, but I would be welcoming of anyone who does use blurple lights to chime in. So the question was, is blurple light better for growth? I heard it makes leaves darker, prevents bleaching. I am really not a light expert, so I just kind of know that like certain color wavelengths promote different stages of growth. I don't know that it definitely makes leaves darker, but it certainly makes leaves appear darker in purple lights. I know that a lot of very serious growers do this, and this probably kind of trickled out from cannabis growth. So I don't know. I really don't know. I have never used purple lights. The closest I got was a light that didn't have blue. It was like yellow and red, so it kind of gave like a very peachy cast, and I didn't like those lights very much in the end. So I really can't answer that question, but I personally wouldn't be surprised if like the blurple in itself wasn't what's making the leaves darker. It would also depend on how strong those lights are. It's the same with full spectrum lights. My guess is that blurple, when you photograph a plant under blurple lights, it will appear darker. I'm gonna give this one water right away because this soil is very dry. I think this is done. Just gonna give it a little squeeze to make sure it fell through all the gaps. I am so proud of this leaf. Like, it's so perfect compared to like what the plant was like before. I'm just so happy. I want to do this more often, like do little foster swaps with friends, because I have plants that I feel like somebody else could revive and make big. Okay, we're gonna do great white as usual. I don't really do that much. I could do more, I guess, but that's about as much as I do. Actually, looking at this water, it's really light. I'm gonna add some more. That was a lot. Oops. Just stirring it with my fingers. Okay, that, I feel like that's a little bit better. There's some sediment at the bottom, but I'm gonna keep using this cup over and over again, so that will stir it up. Some turbulence. And then I'm just gonna water over the root zone. I get asked this all the time of like how I use great white, and this is like 99% of the time how I use it. But if I'm really antsy about a repot and I'm like, it needs to grow roots or that plant is going to die and I cannot lose this plant, then I will sprinkle some dry over the roots as well. Just a little bit more, still feels, okay, that's better. Yay, that one's done. Who should I do next? Maybe I'll do my other Ace Lux. And I'm gonna really try not to disturb the substrate for this one, just because of this new leaf. Okay, I'm looking through the questions. There's so many questions on watering. Like how to know when to water. What level of moist is best? Soggy versus damp. I think it's always safer to be damp, so long as you have enough damp to like go through the entire substrate. Because if I just like dampen the top and it never really reaches the bottom, the plant isn't really encouraged to go searching for water near to the bottom of the pot. So the roots kind of just like stay at the top. I've never really had that like experience to be like, oh, that's exactly what happens. But you know how sometimes like your roots will just kind of be like at the top. They might even be going upwards, like out of the pot from the top. So that's kind of like an added benefit to having this little leca layer at the bottom, because if you're unsure, you could just fill a bit there, and it's a very passive like wicking method to bottom water your plants, and you can visually see how much water you've given that plant. But with anthuriums, it's really like be consistent, so don't let it be like damp always for a while and then go through like a really long dry spell and then give it a deep drink. That's where a lot of issues can happen. Okay, let's get the leca out really gently and then just plop it into the next pot. This is not advised, by the way, to repot a plant when there's a new leaf coming out. Definitely do not repot an anthurium when it's like flowering and you've pollinated that. Like, just even if you want to repot it, just don't, because that plant, like, it will abort the inflow sooner than it will abort a leaf. And definitely don't chop your anthuriums if they're in flower and you've pollinated it. But if you don't care about that flower, then chop away. Now, what pot am I gonna do? Is this enough of an upsize? It's better than nothing. Just because I'm running out of space in my tent. So I'm just like, I don't think I have space for another one of these, because I've really just, the tent is at a minus level of space. This would be what I'd ideally do, this kind of upsize. But seeing as we're low on space, we're gonna just give it a mini upsize. I'm just gonna give it a small leca layer so I have more space for soil. Also, another benefit to using this leca layer, leca for me is probably one of my cheapest components, like substrate components. So I get to like save on, actually over time, quite a bit of tree fern, quite a bit of, I guess my soil is maybe on the cheaper side as well, because this like mycorrhizae soil that I use from ProMix is quite accessible. There's so many dead mushroom bodies in here. Do you use Physan 20 or other preventative? Then Physan 20 is a fungicide. I don't have Physan 20. I have Phyton 35, and I haven't used it in so long, like years. But we got this from the States one time when Charmaine was down there. Oh, I also have copper fungicide. I think it's the Bonide brand. I don't really deal with fungal issues. This looks fungal. I don't think it's fungal because it didn't spread. It had this just like weird, it was like yellowing, but not in like a fungal way. It wasn't like looking like a wound. It was just yellow, kind of like a patterning on the leaves. But as you can see, I did nothing to it and it pushed this thing out and it seems to have fixed itself. I realized that with the use of myco, and I don't know if it's correlated, I feel like it has to be though, that I don't really have fungal issues in the substrate, as in like, I don't have mold growing on the substrate. I have so many mushrooms growing all the time, but I don't see these as like detrimental to the health of the plant. In the past, I've had powdery mildew kind of, I'm calling it powdery mildew because it looks just like powdery mildew, but I'm not a mycologist. And that was from misting plants within an enclosure and just kind of like letting those leaves stay quite damp. And there's not any airflow because it's in an enclosure, or like very little airflow, I should say. And I definitely don't preventatively use fungicide just because I rely so heavily on myco and I don't want to kill the myco. There are certain fungicides that will not kill mycorrhizal fungi. I just don't know what they are and I don't want to risk it just as like a preventative thing to just preventatively treat fungal infections. I just don't have that issue. But if you get like blight or powdery mildew, it can be super infectious. So it would be best, I think, to treat with fungicide really heavily. And if it doesn't work, just start chopping off leaves. That's what I would do. I don't want it spreading through my entire collection. But if you do use a fungicide and you do want to reintroduce mycorrhizal fungi after that, then I would treat it, give it at least, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks before you re-inoculate. Because if you re-inoculate right away, it's kind of like, especially if it's a systemic fungicide and the fungicide lives within the plant, and like the myco is trying to interact with the plant roots, it's going to kill it anyway. So best to just save your money and just let the fungicide do its thing and then re-inoculate, like I would probably say a month to be safe. Sizing up tips. My seedlings are staying tiny. I had another section in part 1 where I talked about upsizing regularly, upsizing proactively, and getting them into much larger pots than you would another genus like a philodendron or something. That has been working really well on getting plants to size up really quickly. With seedlings though, this is kind of a different story. A lot of the times people will use communal pots for seedlings just to save on space, because I definitely do that when I first plant the seeds. I don't have them each in individual pots until they've germinated and started growing leaves. And at that point I can go through and like pick out like ones that don't germinate, ones that are really, really, really behind compared to the others. But at the same time, I do like to give those seedlings a little bit of like a grace period. So if something is quite far behind, I would still give it a chance to be potted up individually and see how it goes from there. Because sometimes it's just being in a communal pot, they're competing with each other for ingredients, nutrients and water. So I want to give it a chance to be independent first. And if it's still kind of like stunted and small, then I would kind of get rid of it. But a lot of people are buying seedlings or anthuriums as seeds. And a lot of people will experience seeds that are like not growing very well. They never size up and they're putting out leaves that are really tiny and they think it's them. And it's not necessarily them. If you give it lots of light, I like to keep them a little bit on the wetter side because I find they take up water really fast. They dry out quickly. They have tiny little pots that don't hold a lot of substrate. They are growing faster than a larger anthurium. I guess like in terms of leaf tissue, it's not growing faster, but they're pushing out leaves, individual leaves quicker. So I just like to keep them a little bit wetter, and they seem to enjoy being in a wetter substrate. So if you're giving them light, giving them warmth, I think humidity is debatable depending on the species. Making sure they have lots of water and you're seeing healthy root growth, but the leaves are really small, it might just be that that's a weak seedling. But if it's like all different seedlings from all different seed batches, different species and hybrids that are all kind of behaving the same way, the first thing I would look at is making sure, well, the two things. First thing would be like, am I on top of the watering? And the second thing is, am I giving it enough light? Seedlings grown in lower light will have like very long petioles, and it almost looks like vegetable sprouts, like this very long with a little leaf on top. Okay, so Ace Lux is done. I typically, if it wasn't pushing out this leaf right now, I would cut these leaves off. But since I stressed it a little bit by like moving the plant, I'm going to leave it. And also there's a little bit of a reservoir here of that great white runoff. I'm going to leave it because you won't be able to tell when I'm feeling this pot. It's not very heavy. So I want to make sure that that substrate has time to soak up that water. Let's do the Wenli next. Oh, it's so cute. I'm so glad that Wenlis are just like so available now. I hope everyone who's ever wanted a Wenli now has a Wenli, because they're just wonderful. They're my favorite strap leaf. Okay, I keep having to stop talking or like re-say what I'm saying because my stomach's rumbling. So we're gonna take a quick break and I will be right back. Okay, I'm back, but the dogs are awake now. They were sleeping. I don't know if you guys could hear them snoring earlier, but now Doug is up and about because he just had a bite of my banana. Are you gonna be nice? He's sitting here like he wants me to give him food. We're done eating. I'm just potting plants now, bub. Okay, I'm just not gonna talk to them and hopefully they'll go back to sleep. Okay, one question was sad pallidiflorum plant meal care. I want to answer this question because you guys, or some of you guys might know that I've been unintentionally abusing my pallidiflorum. So I had one that I imported in like 2020 or something like that. And it was doing really well. And then it started declining because the pot was too small. It was way too root bound. So I got it out of the pot, except in doing so, I snapped the entire, like I was doing this, but the stem was kind of over the substrate and it was so stuck in that pot that when I tried to pull it, I just snapped the top of it off and it didn't have any roots. And the lucky thing is that pallidiflorum is so easygoing. It's, Doug, can you, shh, Doug, So Pallidiflorum is like one of the easiest plants, like easiest going anthuriums. I will say that is one of the best for like a beginner when you're just kind of dipping your toes in anthuriums. It's so rewarding to grow. And because I had experience importing them a couple of times, I just knew that they're just easy to root from import. When I imported that Pallidiflorum, the one that I broke in half, that one had 0 roots when I first got it. That was in 2020 when like Tropicals and Ecuagenera were sending out plants with like almost no roots because they just couldn't keep up with the demand, and they were just like chopping their plants up into a million pieces and sending them out. I'm just potting this as close to the front as possible, so I'm just like squishing it up against the front and just filling from the back because I need that stem to be able to clear the lip of the pot and be able to hang downwards, because that's going to be how this plant grows. It's not going to grow up. It's going to go like this and then like start growing downwards. So anyway, that one was so easy. It was rooting within a few days in moss. So I was like, it's going to be fine. So I potted it in tree fern and stuck it back in my tent, and it did drop like a couple of leaves and they just yellowed off without having any root system. But it took a couple months and it fully rooted again. It's fully rooted and out in my open shelving in my plant room now. But when I tried to take out the bottom half of that stem, that had grown a bunch of different plants. So I just basically, like, when I broke the top off, I planted that separately, but the original pot with all the huge root system and the bottom chunk, I just left it and it grew like 3 growth points. So when I tried to take that one out again, I snapped it again. So those little baby plants that had grown out of the auxiliary buds, those ones were again rootless plants with leaves. So I just stuck those in water instead. And then when I had little kind of active yellow tip roots growing out, I put it into tree fern, but then I kept that tree fern a little bit wetter. They're in my tent right now and they've each grown leaves. They've continued rooting in that tree fern. So Pallidiflorum, I would feel like if it's sad plant mail, it's one of the best anthuriums for that to happen to because they're so resilient. I think I'm going to do another video specifically on my anthuriums growing in room conditions. I still have to film my entire anthurium collection video, and I'm thinking of maybe like splitting it into 2 halves because, like I mentioned before, I have like 75 anthuriums and I can't do that all in one video. So I was thinking maybe I'll split it into like anthuriums in room conditions and then anthuriums growing in a greenhouse. But the question is, what are the easiest and hardest anthuriums to acclimate to room humidity? There's some that you should not even try because that's just like not how they've evolved to grow. It's like trying to grow a philodendron Linhanoniae in a living room. I feel like if someone was able to do that, then they have some sort of mutant specimen that is just doing something that plant's not meant to do. So like cloud forest species, very bolate ones like rugulosum is possible. A little bit more low humidity tolerant than splendidum, but they have like really microscopic little pebbles all over them. Those tend to not do as well because they have so much surface area to transpire and lose moisture. And just as an aside, if you're unsure of like conditions and you're not very confident on being able to grow anthuriums just yet, always ask the seller what conditions they're being given right now. A lot of people will be giving better conditions, like very optimal greenhouse conditions, just because they will grow faster that way. So a lot of sellers will be growing their plants to sell in optimal conditions. But it doesn't hurt to ask like whether they've had experience growing that plant in less than ideal conditions. So let me just focus on plants that I've like acclimated to room humidity and it's been doing really well. So one anthurium that just acclimated flawlessly to dry room conditions is King of Spades. This is done, by the way. Oh, it's so cute. My little Wenley. So when I first got my King of Spades, this was like in 2021, I think. I was growing it, I think in an exo. Yeah, it was growing in an exo since day one and it was doing really well. But it got a little bit big. So then I was like chopping it back, and then eventually I was just like, let's just try growing it in like my open shelving in my plant room, you know, like the big one that sits below the exos. So that one was just like so perfect. It was like, it's one thing to like bring an anthurium out of a greenhouse and it not be crisping up older leaves, but it's another thing to then grow another leaf and that leaf expand well. So the King of Spades pretty much did that really, really flawlessly. Another one that has done really well transitioning out of my tent is Queen of Hearts. So that one I chalk up to Hybrid Vigor, but that one was living in my tent. So I got it from Tazula, or like I ordered it through Lauren from Tazula. It came here, it was living in her shop for a while because she was kind of like acclimating for me because I was going away on holidays. I got it from her and I just threw it immediately in my tent. And of course, like it did well in my tent, enjoyed my tent, and it was growing nicely, but then it got too big. So I again moved it straight like cold turkey out into my open shelving. The first leaf it grew, it was zero rips. It wasn't an upsize, but it was zero rips. So I call that like a pretty perfect transition. VGI is great for growing outside of a greenhouse. It does not crisp. This one used to live in my tent, and this was a leaf that was grown in room conditions. I mean, glossy ones tend to do better outside of a greenhouse, but that's minusing like Splendidum and other glossy but very pebbly bolete plants. Luxurians, people say it's such an easy plant and it's like good at tolerating low humidity. I don't disagree, but I don't 100% agree either. I find luxurians a little bit water loving, like more water loving and less tolerant of any sort of dryness. So whenever my luxurians got underwatered, and I'm actually thinking of moving them to soil for that reason because they're all growing in pond. Whenever they got even a little bit dry, the entire leaf margin would turn yellow. It would slowly creep in from the outside. I also find that to be the case. Actually, I'm gonna keep this substrate. I'm not gonna get rid of it. I find that to be the case with Lux hybrids as well, but maybe not as severe as Luxurians. And one reason why I wanted to move it to soil is because Lauren has multiple flowering size Luxurians that she's been using for her breeding, and they are all in soil and they do really well. And they're way, way bigger than mine are. My Luxurians, I actually imported that from Indonesia because I just couldn't get one. And this was before Equigenera and Tropical started carrying Luxurians, and I was just like, I just had to have one. So I got it from Indonesia as a small little plant. So what they would sell now as a seedling. And it is really small for the age. So I actually feel like I might move that one to pond. Sorry, not pond. Move it to tree fern soil and see how that goes. I've been testing the tree fern soil on Lux hybrids, but I haven't done it with my Luxurians. What's another one that does well in room humidity? Oh, Wenlingeri. Wenlingeri was also a flawless transition. It came out of my tent, went onto my shelf, cold turkey again, and the first leaf was a pretty big upsize from the last one, and it was also without any rips. The one thing about Wenlingeri though, because it's such a long leaf, or I guess when it gets to a certain size, is that you cannot let it dry out, because when it warps in such a way that it's more exaggerated than like a heart-shaped leaf. It's like so much warping that it like curls and like it looks like pulled back on itself. And I also find that it needs CalMag in order to make sure that those leaves all emerge and grow flat. How do I decide which substrate to use out of the ones that I use? So I mainly use tree fern, like amended tree fern soil, amended pond, and aeroid mix, like a soil mix. That's kind of hard for me to answer because like sometimes I just go with like my gut instinct. Previously, when I was using a pond for the majority of my anthuriums, I would then move it to a different substrate if it wasn't growing as quick or it wasn't rooting really robustly as my other plants. I don't like to repot a plant like rapidly, so I like to give it some time to like get used to the new substrate, especially if it was completely different from the old substrate. But as of right now, because of like, I think the standard was set way too high by tree fern soil. If I'm not seeing like immediately a growth point is activated, immediately root tips, like healthy yellow root tips are forming everywhere, then I'm just like questioning whether that's the right substrate for that plant. I will honestly say, like, I feel like everybody has a substrate that they just are the most fond of. And for that, for me right now, it's tree fern, but it used to be pond. So I was the most comfortable with pond. And I am a believer that like our plants will do best with whatever we're comfortable with, because we're the most confident with how much water to give it, how often to water it. And another substrate which might work so well for somebody else, but for some reason, if we're not like that confident on it, or like we're not that experienced with it, or we just deep down don't like it as much for whatever reason, is probably your plant is not going to do as well in that. So I guess my advice would be start with whatever you feel the most confident in. And then if it's not working, then try something else. And whenever you're transitioning plants, whenever people like, let's say, I want to try pond, and they immediately transition all of their plants to pond, that scares me so much, because you're like putting all of your eggs in that one basket. And then if you have to then deal with like, I don't know, 50 plants that are declining, if for some reason the plants don't like it and they're rotting their roots, it was like transplant shock. Dealing with it on that level makes me really nervous. So if you're ever trying a new substrate, doesn't even matter how much like the people around you, and I include myself in that, if I'm telling you that tree fern fiber and soil mixed together is like the most magical substrate, because I think it is, please do not transition every single plant to that. I would always start with a plant that you wouldn't mind if it started to like decline, or start with one that's already not very happy, because it probably is wanting a change anyway. Okay, so VTI is done. Nope, it's not. I missed a little gap here. This was one of the first plants I ever planted in tree fern. I think that actually was tree fern soil. And I remember this plant being like, well, this is a very slow growing anthurium. And I remember never having like a full pot of roots. And this was like the only substrate that this plant was really happily rooting in. Okay, so that's now done. And I'm actually gonna cut off these yellow leaves. I don't know if you can see, this petiole has snapped. I think it got snapped when I was like moving it around in the tent. And then this leaf, I just might as well cut it. Give you a fresh start. So now if I pull back the sheath, so this is the sheath of this newest leaf. And that's the newest sheath that hasn't died off yet. I just want to pull it back and see if there's an active growth point in there. Yep, there is. So I'm just going to be like monitoring this to see if it continues pushing growth. In my experience, my anthuriums are always constantly growing, and when I move it to a new, like I'm repotting it, like what I just did with this one, and I give it myco, I don't see it pause for very long. So I'm expecting it to like continuously push this new leaf. I don't expect it to happen as quickly for this one because it's growing outside of a tent, but do expect something. I don't expect it to stay dormant after this repot. Now this plant shouldn't be getting as underwatered as it was before. I think that was maybe like a year and a half since I had potted that one in. Okay, I also touched on this in part 1, but just to expand on this, the question, well, there's a bunch of questions about like cuttings, like a chonk with no leaves, how to make it wake up, what do you do when it's just like not doing anything. So in that first part, I said like some plants just take a really long time. And for me, that plant was regale. And a lot of people say that Warocqueanum is really bad at waking up. I also find that very old, mature chonks will take a really long time to wake up. You could maybe like try to wake it up by just like scraping back some of the dead tissue on the outside, especially around the growth points, just to make it like feel like it's in contact with moisture. But if it doesn't have roots, it's going to take much longer to wake up than a cutting with roots. So I avoid cutting a rootless chonk as much as possible. So I just did that actually with this plant. So I chopped off the only part with leaves. I really didn't have a choice because like I want to propagate this for Charmaine, so the only part I could have chopped off didn't have leaves attached, because you see like here all the leaves are attached together, so there's no way I could have cut that without just giving her a rootless leafless chunk. But that was actually what we received that plant as, and it woke up just fine. So I feel like it's not gonna take forever, but if it's not doing anything and is not rotting, it's just a waiting game. Provided you're making sure it gets quite high light, like higher light than any of your plants. So get it really close to a grow light. That will also make sure that there's warmth on the plant because the grow lights are warmer. I also mentioned that like in the summertime, they tend to wake up a little faster than in the winter time, at least for me in Canada. And I just kind of leave them alone. And every now and then I will just make sure that it's not like covered in these little, they're not springtails because they don't do that jumping thing, but they're like kind of this like dark silvery color, and they're kind of just crawling all over eating decay. I just call them soil mites. I don't know what they are. I feel like people say they're springtails, but they don't behave like springtails to me because, yeah, springtails spring, right? Anyways, those ones are attracted to decay. So if there's like a chunk and I just see it's crawling with these mites, then I'm like, crap, I need to maybe like check on it. If I could save it in some way and just like remove some of the dead tissue and there's still like a viable growth point left there, I will try to do that. But really, I just kind of leave them alone and check on them every few weeks. And yeah, one question was, do you repot anthuriums when root bound? Is growing big leaves despite that? I repot them when they're root bound. So this is my most root bound one that I'm repotting today. And I'm repotting it because it's not sizing up anymore. This leaf is the newest leaf. This is the leaf before it. I would say if your plant is like continuing to size up despite being root bound and you don't want to repot it, then don't repot it. Oh my gosh, this one's really stuck. I really want to be able to save these ones. I feel like this one for sure I can. Maybe these ones, they push themselves out of the smallest hole. There are certain plants that I want to repot because I haven't repotted in, oh my gosh. Hey, that wasn't too bad. Oh no, wait. We lost these root tips. It's not like I'm lacking for roots. I want to repot a couple of ones because I've had them in the same pot for probably like coming up to 2 years, but they're the largest pots I have, so they're just gonna live in there, and that's that. But when it's like going from small to medium to large, I like to repot them sooner now. That's like my 2024 method. This is also a question I get constantly, and I see it being asked like elsewhere as well. And the question is, do you use great white only during repotting? Like, how often do you use it? Can you overdo it? I'll tell you what I'd like to do, and I'll tell you what I actually do. So what I'd like to do is I do always use it when repotting. Like I just showed you how I like dissolve it in water and water it over the root zone. And like sometimes if I'm really scared, then I'll sprinkle it over the roots. And I'll just expand on like what's a level of scared I'd need to be to like sprinkle it dry over the roots. Let's say I chopped my Carla and the top had like a few healthy roots, but not a ton. And I'm like, I need this plant to survive, or I will just quit plants altogether. That's where I would be sprinkling dry over the roots. I also did this with another Monstera that I was like really antsy about, because that Monstera, every time I repot it, doesn't matter if it had a root system that was huge and full, doesn't matter if it's going from the same substrate to the same substrate, it would just drop all of its roots every time. So that time I moved it from water, I'd rooted it in water, and then I moved it to pond. And I just went ham on the great white all over the roots. And that one actually rooted so well, and it's huge now. I actually need to film a video trying to repot that thing because it's humongous. So during a repot, I always use great white. And in a perfect world, I would re-inoculate maybe every month or so. And basically like when I'm watering my plants, in place of fertilizer, I would just put great white in the water and go through and water my collection with that. What I actually do is whenever, like let's say I'm repotting right now and I have this like cup of great white water and I have some left, I just go and dump it in the thirstiest pot that I can find. But I guess in general, if my plants are getting repot a couple of times a year, at least once a year, they're getting re-inoculated at least once a year. So that's my thinking. It's not the end of the world. And you can't overdo it very easily. I think the worst thing about overdoing great white is how much it's going to cost you and how much it's going to like use up your great white. I know in the States it's not as expensive as it is here in Canada, because it is available in Canada. It's just more expensive than in the States. But even in the States, it's not cheap. Especially when I think about like the conversion. maybe it's not even that different, but it is more expensive in Canada. So I don't think it's super necessary to inoculate all the time. I feel like if you're doing it like every other watering or every watering, that is maybe overkill, because like if your roots have already formed a relation with the fungi is also multiplying in the substrate. So at a certain point, you're gonna be almost like at capacity, and if like there's not enough nutrients to go around for the fungi and the plant to trade, then I feel like it's maybe you've gone over the threshold of what is like efficient and necessary. So I think in a perfect world, I would do, when repotting, to reduce transplant shock. I'm gonna try something really quick. I just had this thought in my mind. I'm gonna try to see if I can fill this, and then will you hold it? I'm never really sure if this part of the root ball gets filled with soil. So far so good. And then, oh, I think that worked. I think it worked. I wish this was sit a little bit lower though. You know what, that's fine. Does every anthurium like semi-hydro? If not, what are they? I think the only one I can think of off the top of my head, and this is just like based on what I have experienced growing, is clarinervium. And that is one plant that I am so mad at. I don't know how people have such an easy time with clarinervium. I've had a couple of specimens. They all do the same. They just don't grow. And then when they grow, they're not really great looking leaves. I can never get like a nice bushy full pot of it like people seem to do so effortlessly. But since it's a Mexican species that I think it is tropical, but it's more adapted to dry conditions and drying out. So you can kind of tell based on the roots of the clarinervium, like they're freaking thick. They're like tree trunks. So they're adapted to holding on to water for longer. So that would probably be one species that I would say would not do well with semi-hydro, or would probably prefer a non-semi-hydro setup where it's allowed to experience a dry cycle. And that would probably be one where like treating Lechuzapon like soil would work, because it's almost like, okay, treating Lechuzapon like soil is how I would pot a succulent. And if there's an anthurium that would do well in that setup, for me, that would probably be clarinervium. And to be fair, I probably could try clarinervium again. It might be okay, and I would just be one of those like decor plants that I never have to water. I'll just treat it like my ZZ plants. So I'm not ruling out clarinervium from ever entering my collection again, but it's really not one that I had very much fun growing. Another species that has the same kind of roots as clarinervium is Diabloense. They're like really thick. They look like turnips. I would guess based on that they would not like semi-hydro as much. But again, I only have had Diabloense for like, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, and I haven't been going in semi-hydro, so I didn't try. But that would be my guess based on how the roots look. Doug is making little squeaking noises as he's sleeping. I don't know if you guys can hear. Oh, he stopped. Oh, do you hear that? Oh, this is kind of related. Best budget-friendly beginner anthurium. Okay, this is gonna depend on where you live, of course. I think the prices on anthuriums has been fluctuating like crazy depending on where you are. I would say budget. Okay, so many people will say clarinervium because they're like garden center plants. They're super available. They've been in cultivation for like a million years. But that's just not been my experience with clarinervium. Unless maybe you are like used to growing very drought tolerant plants like snake plants, ZZ plants, succulents, and so on. Maybe that would be like a nice seamless transition to anthuriums, but just don't expect other anthuriums to kind of behave the same way. But if you want to like get your feet wet with something that kind of behaves and like requires the same care as a lot of less budget friendly anthuriums, like Polydiflorum is a great one, but I just don't know how accessible it is everywhere. But if you were to like import it from Ecogenera or Tropicals, it's not very expensive, and you can get a seedling size of it, and they size up really drastically and they start growing pretty fast. So I would say it's not even a bad idea to start from like a small plant, like leaves like this size. Crystallinum, and I'm talking like a proper crystallinum, like ones with like a very brilliant silver, very clean veins, quite dark. Those ones, I think, are not like a walk in the park easy, but it does get your feet wet with anthuriums, and they really do behave and have some of the same challenges, but just not on a level that is like it's gonna die. So I think crystallinum's great, and it's so classic. It's such a beautiful, beautiful plant. I just love crystallinum so much. I would probably classify forgetii and crystallinum as like the same level, not full-on beginner, but not difficult, and they're also quite easy to replace if you were to kill it. I mean, I feel like a pure, true crystallinum that's not been crossed with magnificum is a little bit harder. And also the dark form forgetii, which some say are the true, pure species forgetii. People speculate that like the forgetii with the silver veins have been crossed with crystallinum, but it's like majority forgetii, so every leaf is peltate. So like the dark form and like the true crystallinum are more difficult to find. I would say for beginners, start with baby plants, because even if you're a beginner, it's easier, way easier to give an anthurium optimal conditions of like warmth, humidity, and good light in an enclosure or something like that if it's like a small plant. So I would really advise against getting like really massive mature specimens if you're just starting out, and especially importing those really massive specimens. The only reason I would import a massive specimen is if I couldn't get something that big locally, and I need it to be that big because I want to start breeding that plant immediately, and it has to be that plant. But otherwise, I would probably advise against importing huge specimens, because like trying to baby something that is so big and is super stressed and probably lost a lot of roots or lost some roots and probably is really thirsty, I just don't think that it's a very fun experience. And I think so many people get into anthuriums or have been getting into anthuriums lately by buying otherwise quite expensive plants as seedlings or seeds or germinated seeds. And I think that is just like so great, because it's a way for people to grow a plant from really baby, and it always has your conditions, and it's not needing to kind of acclimate to your conditions or whatever you give it. So I think as long as the expectation isn't that that plant will look exactly like the mom or it's going to be as robust as the mom, as long as you set your expectations low, worst case you get pleasantly surprised, then I think that's such a great way to start growing anthuriums. Okay, this is the red crystallinum luxurians done. It was not the best upsize. Like I would have preferred bigger, but like I said, there's no room. But at least now it's not as root bound. Oh, I can't forget to inoculate. I have only one left, so I'm just gonna do maybe like a couple more questions. In winter, my plants drink way less. How to adapt to that? It feels weird to only water every 10 days, but otherwise they're all having root rot. Something that I've done in the past, and I see other people do as well, is employ grow lights in certain areas only during the dark winter months. Perfect. So yeah, I think that's the main struggle in the winter with people experiencing root rot, is because they're kind of not adapting their watering schedule. So the person who asked this is obviously trying to adapt, but like just doesn't feel right not watering their plants. So if you haven't already increased the light, that also increases the photosynthesis, and then the plant therefore needs more water. Because I don't really find myself watering very seldomly through the winter, and that's because I rely 100% on grow lights. This house is so dark. Even in the summertime, like I could not really grow any plants just on straight natural sunlight. It's just not going to happen. There's maybe one part of the house, like one window that could happen, and just not going to be viable to grow a lot of my plants in that room because it's just such a small space. Just going to reuse this leca. So yeah, if you find that you're getting a lot of root rot because your plants are sitting wetter for longer, I mean, guess there's a few things you could do. You could increase the light. You could, I guess, preemptively next year, I guess, up before winter, pot in something chunkier. I'm guessing if you're asking this question, you enjoy watering anyways. I personally try to increase water retention because I don't enjoy watering as much. And with good lighting, the plant should be able to grow through the winter. I've been having a lot of great growth over the winter with my anthuriums, but if you're giving them light and stuff and you're still not having to water your plants very often, but your plants are still growing, I would honestly just enjoy not having to water that much. Ooh, if you are sick, drained, burned out, what's the most important minimum to keep up regarding plant care for anthuriums? Anthurium plant care, I should say. Simply watering. Just water. You do not need to upsize the pots. You do not need to do all that. That's like nice to have kind of situation. Make sure they don't dry out, and that's really it. I like having these leca layers at the bottom because it's insurance for me for watering. Like if I were to have to like go away, because like with my line of work right now, might have to travel like within a couple weeks notice, and I wouldn't be able to have like a nice month to like upsize my pots slowly, monitor them. So if I needed to leave tomorrow at a pinch, I could leave a reservoir on these plants and they'd be fine. I think really utilize the good days, because like I've had really hard times that like I just had no motivation to even look at my plants. Just looking at them stressed me out. But there are good days, right? Like utilize those good days to tackle the things that I think nourish a lot of people mentally, like repotting, like getting your hands dirty and really feeling like you're taking care of and nurturing your plants. Save that for the good days. And then when you're not feeling great, give them nice, good drinks of water. You could fertilize at the same time if you wanted to. For me, it's second nature. Every time I fill my watering can, it's just like a couple pumps of fertilizer goes in there. I guess another thing is like make sure that your fertilizer is accessible to you in some way. So having to get a dropper out and measure it every time, open a bottle cap, pour, make a mess, that's going to deter you from wanting to use that fertilizer. So using a soap pump bottle, the ones I use are from Muji. But using that, oh my gosh, game changer for me. It's so much less messy. It's so easy to dispense fertilizer. One thing I've done for holiday prep, like when I was going away for 3 weeks, I just reduced the amount of time my grow lights were turning on, because it was summer when I went away and I only planned on having Jing come over to water once in that time, and it was going to be really warm. So I wanted to make sure my plants didn't use up all the water really quickly. So I typically run my grow lights for 12 hours, like 8 to 8 or 8 to 9. I just reduced it by half to about 6 hours. I wouldn't say that every plant was perfect when I came back, but I didn't really have any plants fully like dry out and get really limp and crispy. The only plant that happened to was my debule, and that's just kind of how debules go. So yeah, I hope those are good enough tips, but water is like the most important thing. And if you can bottom water and leave a reservoir and just kind of give yourself a little bit of a grace period for when you're not feeling great, or even if you're just like simply too busy to stay on top of watering, that is really helpful. Oh, okay. So the leaf aborting thing, there's a few questions about that. So like that's when a leaf comes out and it never unfurls and it just shrivels off and dies. In part one, I showed you one, and that one was due to root rot. But I wanted to share another story where that happened. I totally forgot to talk about this in that first video. Sometimes anthuriums will keep trying to push out leaves and the leaf just like stays at that curl up stage, and then it slowly limps off, and it usually shrivels up right at the top of the petiole, and like you're confused because the roots look good. This happened to me on one plant. I think it was like a mag pappy kind of hybrid. It was an Indonesian hybrid, and I think Charmaine either has that now or it died. I don't remember, but I did sell it to Charmaine, and that plant did that to me, I'm not kidding, like 5 times in a row. I was like trying to get advice from other friends who had been growing anthuriums for longer, because at that point I maybe had been growing anthuriums for like 6 months or something. So I just didn't know what I was like even looking for, like what is actually wrong, because it was living in my exo, it's getting light and warmth and humidity. So one of my friends was like, it's hungry, it doesn't have enough energy and food and nutrients to push a leaf. So feed it with something. And at that point I was using liquid dirt and Marfil. So they're both organic fertilizers. And she was like, these are not strong enough. They're not nutritious enough. Use something synthetic that has a lot more punch to it. And by the way, I do not like liquid dirt. To me, it was not a very useful, it was the same as watering with just brown water. Like it really didn't do anything for me. So anyway, I started watering with CalMag and the Schultz fertilizer, the really cheap one in the dropper that you can get at every garden center. And that didn't really work. So that's when I discovered Myco, and I don't even know where I saw it. Like I was just like, mycorrhizal fungi. So then I just started Googling it and I was like, well, this sounds amazing. So I started using Myco. I'm not joking. The next leaf perfect. Every leaf after that, perfect. So it's definitely a nutrition related thing. And it was maybe like, I don't know, maybe it was nutrient lockout on that plant. I have no idea. It was so long ago and I just didn't know enough to be able to know what I was doing wrong and even be able to like tell you truthfully what I had put in that mix and how often I was watering, because it was way too long ago. But if it was nutrient lockout, then myco would have been the answer to breaking down those nutrients in a more available form to the plant. Whatever it was, myco was the answer. So if that's ever happening to you over and over again, and your roots are really healthy, and maybe it's not too root bound, and you have stayed on top of the watering whenever it's pushing out a leaf, and you're not using myco yet, I would really highly recommend myco. It's probably the one plant product I would push everyone to be using. When I first bought it, this is the size that I bought. I think it was like $30 or something. It lasted me over a year. Just in the way that I've been using it, like just dusting it into a cup, watering my plants with it, it lasts a really long time. So cost per use is very low. Okay, that's my last plant done. It looks a little bit silly. It looks really small compared to the pot, but I'm hoping it will start sizing up. Every leaf, I'm not joking, has been the same size. It's not sizing up at all. So hopefully we'll jumpstart it. I didn't even repot it that long ago. I feel like I repotted this like 3 or 4 months ago. And with Great White, I just feel like there's just this safety blanket, because whatever I don't know that the plant needs, the myco and the plant as a team will figure it out. I just feel so much better about growing plants with myco. I feel better about like decay within the substrate being properly like broken down with myco and the bacteria inside. I just feel like I don't always worry about root rot, because I just know sometimes that will just get taken care of by the microbes. And almost every plant that I unpot will have like a rotten root tip here and there, but the plant is not showing any signs of like distress due to it, until of course it gets like too bad, like the Magcuna. Oh, I have to repot that one. Oops. Ooh, one question is, do anthuriums revert from caterpillar stage? You know how like sometimes philodendrons will revert, like it'll be in caterpillar stage and then it'll go back to growing from a petiole or sheath? That, to my knowledge, has never happened to me. And for that reason, I think maybe it's not something that anthuriums do often, but I think it might be possible. But one way it's definitely possible is if your plant goes through some sort of stress, gets some sort of fungal attack, and then the top caterpillar rots, and it's rotten to a point that like it can't even push out a growth from there. It's like fully dead. Then the plant will be forced to activate something lower down. But I think that if it was gonna do that on a pretty established plant, it will go back to caterpillars pretty quickly. Kind of the same as philodendrons. Like if you cut from a very mature stem, it will size up a little bit faster. If you cut from a very juvenile plant, it takes a long time for it to grow back. If you chop an anthurium from a mature stem, in my experience, it will size up to a more mature form much quicker. I know it sounds like I just repeated what I said, but like if you chopped a baby plant down to like the very juvenile, like this thin stem at the bottom, the first leaves for me look just like seedling growth, whereas a first leaf from a more mature chunk can look a little bit more like something like this. I know that's not what the question asked, but just something that popped in my head. Moving from soil to pond, or I guess transitioning to any sort of different substrate, what to look for if it's unhappy, or how long to wait before trying something new? That's such a good question. So if it's going from like soil to pond, pond to soil, it's probably quite different. I would say if it's starting to look unhappy, if it's starting to look limp and thirsty, then I would immediately look at the roots. Whenever I'm repotting a plant, if I can, I try to move the active roots, like the healthiest roots, out to the very edge, so I can actually see if they continue growing. And if they rot, then I'll obviously be able to catch that. This plant has so little roots that I'm really struggling to pot it and getting it to stay put. So if the roots look happy and it's starting to drop some leaves, I would be okay with it for a little bit. The thing you really want to make sure is the root system is happy and whether there are actively growing roots. And if it's actively growing, but it kind of got a little bit yellow on the lower down leaves, I would leave it for a little while constantly monitoring the roots. But if you're seeing root rot on a transplant, I would probably personally get it out right away and just rehab it in something that I feel really safe in, and maybe something like a little bit more sterile. Okay, so the Macuna's done. This one is a little bit more fine. I don't know, just the section that I was pulling the soil from just wasn't as chunky, which I think is okay because I think the majority of the issues I've had with this plant up until now has been because I let it dry out, and it does not like to dry out. I don't own a Kunai lens, but that's what I hear, is that they're just not very good with low humidity, and they don't love or don't tolerate being dry very easily. Ooh, how much stem can be buried in deeper pot without inducing stem rot? I forgot to tell you guys, I just did that with my tofu getii. So I potted this, I don't know if you're gonna be able to see, right up to the top part of the stem. So it's like the only part that's exposed is the top growth. I saw some roots starting to poke out from the exposed stem. That's how I like to pot my anthuriums. That would encourage the strongest, fullest root system, because when too much stem is above the substrate, if your environment is at all dry, it will come out a little bit and kind of dry off, and it'll just be like little nubbins that never extend into the substrate. But if you're growing inside of a high humidity environment, then they will have the moisture to continue growing out and then go into the substrate. So I personally like to, you can see it on this plant, but I pot it right up to the top growth. I haven't had issues with stem rot. Sometimes when you have a petiole buried at the bottom, so you'll see it on this plant, again, my tofu getii, these bottom leaves, the petiole is like half buried. Some of that will die off sometimes, but I don't really mind. I would rather have more root growth at the top and allow that plant to be able to take up more water, especially if you're going to chop that plant at any point. You want that top growth to be full of roots. Like if you have those little nubbins, I wouldn't be chopping a plant like that. Or unless you're okay with it like taking a long time to root, and I probably would be rooting something like that in water. Just a little bit more. I'm not gonna make this too wet because it is a little bit of a denser mix, but yeah, should be good. Fingers crossed. And then the last thing I gotta do is my chunky chunk. Where is it? So this, okay, I'm gonna show you this stem. This is the old stem that it was chopped from. This green part right up here, the skinny part of the stem, is what I grew. So I'm going to plant this way up because I'm pretty sure the first nose to activate will probably be around this area, but I'm not going to fully submerge the stem. So I'm going to just like plant this maybe halfway up and then do the dome method, which you will see in just a second, except I'm going to use tree fern fiber instead of tree fern soil. Ooh. And this tree fern has some perlite and pond mixed in, but not a ton. I actually find it's really difficult to get tree fern and leca and pond to kind of mix homogeneously unless you use like so much pond. Like this. You can't see. You'll see the finished product. So I'm just placing it like this. It doesn't even need to be this big. I think this is kind of a big pot cup for this size of a chunk, but that's what I have. So this is how much I have it buried. It's just buried up to here. It still has space to activate something lower down. So if by chance it starts to grow from like the big part of the stem down below the substrate, I didn't pack this very much, so it still has enough room and fluffiness to kind of push through the tree fern. And then I'm just gonna do a few pieces of tape. I usually do 3 pieces. I find 2 is a little bit too dangly. And I just have to label it, but this is gonna go to Charmaine. And that's my dome method. I would usually like be watering, but this tree fern was pretty wet, so I don't really think it needs water. Maybe I'll just do like a few drops. But yeah, when you're doing the dome method, you don't need that much water in there because it's all enclosed. So you actually want it to just be like damp and not like a watered plant with roots. And I didn't do great white because there's one little like nubbin of a root, 2 little nubbins of a root. I really don't think that's going to do anything. So that's my favorite method to pot up leafless chunks. And now we are done repotting. I had to move. Oh, Dougie. I had to move over here because the light is depleting. Now Doug is really interested. Look how big he is. Look at how big this chunk nugget is. He's so big now. It's crazy. Anyways, that is it for this little repot Q&A. Thank you guys so much for submitting the questions. It really, really helps me structure these kind of videos. This boy probably needs to go out for a wee wee, don't you? You need to go out for a wee wee, huh? Oh, he's so cute. He's so freaking cute. Thank you guys so much for hanging out. I love you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.